thanks to all of you for coming along this afternoon. Where's my clicker? Here we go. In many countries right now around the world, distrust in leaders and institutions is really on the rise, and societal cohesion is declining. Each year, the Edelman Trust Barometer shows a rather dismal trend, showing that people increasingly think that the way wealth is distributed is unfair and that those in positions of power are lying to us. In Singapore, thankfully, levels of cohesion remain somewhat higher than in many other countries. But even here in Singapore, there are some signs of declining trust. For example, recent polls suggest that the wealthy are perceived as taking more than their fair share, that grievances are increasing, and that trust in leaders may be declining. And at this year's annual conference of the Institute of Policy Studies, the director of the IPS argued that cohesion in Singapore is coming under strain, particularly among younger people. And one of the factors that may be contributing to these trends in many parts of the world is the way our news consumption is increasingly tailored to our viewing histories. Algorithms track what kinds of news content we like to view and accordingly direct us towards more and more of it. Ultimately, what shapes the content of the news, of course, is its capacity to sell advertising space. In a recent analysis of 1,276 news articles, a recent paper published in Journalism Studies concluded that newsworthy stories typically tend to focus on titillating or human interest themes, such as transgressions and scandals, and stories that audiences find alarming or upsetting. In the world of news coverage, this is the stuff that sells. Again, things may not be as bad in Singapore as in many other countries. Having state-run news may make it less common to run stories about corrupt leaders than would be the case in the UK, for example. But there's still an underlying assumption that transgressions in general, for example, on the part of overseas leaders or just ordinary citizens, make for good news stories. These are just a few random examples from yesterday's edition of the Straits Times. As a byproduct of our ideas about what's newsworthy, we, the consumers of news, at least in countries like the UK and Germany and France and the US, increasingly see our leaders as on the make and think that resources are divided unfairly and that institutions are becoming less transparent. This in turn makes us more vulnerable to exploitation by populists who convince us that they can offer protection against corrupt elites. And only they, as true leaders of the popular masses, can faithfully serve the interests of the people. In the process, they stir up divisions in society, harnessing the corrosive effects of the news to convince us that social inequalities are deepening, that immigration is spiraling out of control, that established institutions can't be trusted. And in this very brief talk, I want to delve deeper into the psychology that the media and populist leaders tap into. In my new book, I argue that a common set of evolved psychological predispositions pervades human behavior everywhere. These evolved biases have been managed and channeled in various ways as societies have grown in size and complexity, but they remain central to the way the world works today. This book is organized into three main parts. The first part sets out the evidence for universal features of human psychology, illustrating many of the findings with experiments and surveys I helped to design in collaboration with various scientists around the world. Part two describes how our evolved psychology has been managed over the millennia. And this part of the book draws heavily on the global history data bank that you just heard about briefly, that I spent many years building with hundreds of historians and archaeologists all around the world. For example, I show how rituals became more routinized, allowing cultural traditions to become more standardized in ever larger populations. I explain how the rise of moralizing religions provided new ways of unifying multi-ethnic empires. And I show how tribalism was extended to enable powerful new globalizing ideologies to become established. Part 3 of the book asks what all of this means for the contemporary world. And I argue that our tendency to imitate has driven us to adopt unsustainable lifestyles, that our moral intuitions are being hijacked by ad agencies and tech platforms, and that our tribalism is driving us into ever deadlier conflicts. The solution, I argue, is not to try to fight back against human nature. We can't eliminate our evolved psychology because it's simply going to resurface with each new generation. Let's start with human morality. A popular idea is that we get our moral ideas from religion. These are results of a Pew survey in which people around the world were asked whether you need to believe in God in order to be moral. And as you can see, in much of the world, the majority of people think that the answer to that question is yes. However, this is actually quite implausible because human moral intuitions are actually very much the same everywhere, irrespective of what religion you happen to subscribe to, if indeed you subscribe to a religion. That is obviously quite a big claim, so let me talk you through the evidence for it. Until quite recently, it was tempting to argue that different cultural groups endorse radically different moral principles, and that your intuitions about what's right and wrong are determined by the culture, including the religion you happen to have grown up in. However, my colleague in Oxford, Oliver Scott Curry, noticed that 7 cooperative principles found across the natural world also underlie our moral reasoning. These 7 principles are: help your group, help your family, return favors, be brave, defer to superiors, divide resources fairly, and respect other people's property. This led us to hypothesize that all 7, because you can see there are 7 listed here, 7 forms of cooperation will be judged morally good in all human societies everywhere. Now, to test that hypothesis, we undertook a huge survey of the writings of anthropologists pertaining to moral values in a sample of 60 societies selected to represent the diversity of all surviving human cultures worldwide, covering all continents and major ethnographic regions. We analyzed thousands of paragraphs of text describing moral judgments, and we found that in 99.9% of all examples, the 7 rules that I just listed were judged morally good rather than morally bad. So going back to the point I was making a bit earlier about the way news feeds work, they essentially play on our universal moral intuitions by presenting us with juicy gossip about the transgressions of others. These transgressions typically involve the 7 universal moral rules. We're drawn into stories about people who are bullies or cowards, people who cheat on their families, who divide resources unfairly, who are on the make. We side with the victims, and we're particularly interested in scenarios in which we ourselves appear as the victims. Our natural interest in moral transgressions and the process of punishment has historically been valuable in maintaining highly cooperative societies. And it works best when we believe that our institutions and the people who run them are able to uphold the moral values that we all share. This is really the essence of legitimate authority. But in many countries, we now find that the work of channeling our moral sentiments is being increasingly taken over by commercial interests in ways that can undermine the legitimacy of the status quo. Populists and conspiracy theorists and disruptors of various kinds can easily take advantage of this. So what's to be done about it? Well, in my book, I argue that we can harness our evolved moral psychology to reverse the decline in trust and cohesion. And I want to start by considering just 2 of the 7 universal moral rules and explore how they can help us. And the 2 I'm going to focus on are caring for kin and being loyal to groups. These are just 2 of the 7 cooperative principles that I mentioned earlier, the ones that are judged morally good everywhere. And both of them are powerful drivers of pro-social behavior. To start digging deeper into this, let's begin with some of the basics of social identity theory. Research in social psychology has shown that we all have basically two distinct kinds of identities. On the one hand, we all have a personal self, qualities that make us unique as individuals. But on the other hand, we're also all members of groups. Typically, we wear many hats as members of different kinds of groups. And most people, most of the time, I think, see their personal and group identities as pretty distinct and separate. So if you make people's group identities salient, their personal identities become less accessible. Partly for this reason, psychologists often describe group identification as depersonalizing. It's a bit like your group identity can eclipse or obscure your sense of self. But there's also another very powerful form of group alignment known as identity fusion, in which your personal identity and your group identity become effectively fused together. If you're fused with a group, your personal and your group identities are activated together, synergistically. So when your personal self is made salient, your group identity is made salient at the same time. And this fosters an enhanced sense of inner strength, even a sense of invulnerability. And it works the other way around as well. If you make the group salient to a fused individual, it taps directly into their personal agency. People who are highly fused with the group say that they'll do pretty much anything to protect fellow group members, risking or even laying down their lives to save them. Now, people become fused in two main ways. One is to undergo an experience that becomes a core feature of who you are. It might be, for example, a painful or frightening ordeal, like fighting together on the battlefield, or maybe going through a particularly intense or painful initiation ritual. When experiences like those become not only part of your personal identity, but are also felt to be group-defining, your personal and group identities become effectively fused together. Another way of becoming fused is to believe that you're made of the same physical substance as other group members. For example, people in the same family typically think that they share the same blood or facial features or other physical traits. Even though different cultures have different ways of conceptualizing shared biology within families, the underlying psychology is always fundamentally the same. For example, people always assume that these shared traits, whatever they may be, are passed down from parents to offspring. Often this notion of shared biology is scaled up so that members of the same tribe believe they're descended from common ancestors, or they might think of their territory as a shared motherland. In large studies of twins, we've shown that both these elements contribute to feelings of fusion among siblings. For example, we found that identical twins are more fused than fraternal twins based on feeling more similar biologically. But independently of those effects, twins who think that they've been through profoundly self-shaping kinds of experiences in life become fused by that method as well. To measure levels of fusion, we typically show people a series of pictures. Each picture contains a small circle, that's you, and a big circle, that's your group. And these circles intersect, as you can see, to varying degrees. At one end of the spectrum, the two circles are completely separate, but at the other end, the little circle, that's your personal identity, is completely enclosed within the larger circle. And people are asked, well, which of these representations best characterizes their relationship to the group? And people who choose this one on the end, where the small circle is contained within the bigger circle, are said to be fused. Fusion is an extremely powerful form of group bonding. If you're fused with your group and it comes under attack, you'll do whatever it takes to protect it, even if that requires, acts of self-sacrifice. We've shown in studies with a really wide range of groups, from hardline Islamists to football hooligans, that fusion plays a crucial role in willingness to defend the group, even at grave personal risk. A good example of this is the work that we did in 2011 during the Arab Spring, when one of my collaborators, Brian McQuinn, managed to get into Libya in the midst of the revolution using his UN contacts. And he in turn managed to help me enter the country to set up a survey with insurgent groups. This is a photo taken of me and Brian McQuinn in what was once a crowded marketplace in Misrata, where Gaddafi's forces tried to hide their tanks quite ineffectually, as you can see, from NATO airstrikes. Our survey was run with 179 members of various revolutionary battalions, or Katiba in Arabic. Half our sample were frontline fighters, and half provided logistical support to the frontline fighters. So they did things like driving ambulances and fixing vehicles. Among the overwhelming majority of insurgents, we recorded ceiling levels of fusion with several groups, including family, friends in your Katiba, and even people you'd never met from other battalions. By contrast, we found close to 0 levels of fusion with fellow Libyans who supported the revolution but weren't members of a Katiba. In other words, it didn't seem to matter that people shared your beliefs or were on the same side as you ideologically. What mattered was being a member of these groups that had suffered together. So next, we said to participants, okay, we understand that you're fused with multiple groups, but if you had to choose one group, which would it be? So this is a forced choice question. And here we found a striking difference between the frontline fighters and the people who provided logistical support to the frontline fighters. If you were a frontline fighter, you were far more likely to choose your friends in the Katiba over your own family. And this was a really striking finding because it meant that your fellow fighters were more like family to you than your actual family. And with providers of logistical support, that wasn't typically the case. This made sense to us, of course, in terms of our theory, because we expected those who suffered most shared dysphoria on the front line to be more fused. But we couldn't rule out an alternative possibility, that what if it was basically fusion that drove these fighters to the front line in the first place? Well, to adjudicate on that question, we ran a series of studies with US troops who had served in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq, but who crucially had no control over their deployment. And we found that here again, intensity of suffering on the front line was associated with higher fusion with unit. This was pretty compelling support for our hypothesis that shared suffering on the front lines was really what was driving the extremely high levels of fusion. Now, identity fusion evolved in small groups. It bound together people in face-to-face communities in which people knew each other personally. So how did we get from that kind of small-scale group bonding to much larger-scale phenomena like nationalism or strong commitment to transnational religions and ethnic identities? In my book, I trace the processes by which military cohesion was scaled up over the millennia and culminated essentially in the emergence of religions capable of fusing us not only to extended groups, but also to the core doctrines that define those groups. These doctrines, or some of those doctrines, eventually became sacred values, ideas worth dying for, and forms of colonial imperialism emerged in which it became a moral obligation to wage holy wars, to bring humanity under the umbrella of a single divinely sanctioned belief system, or to kill the heathens and heretics who refused. All this has relevance, of course, to understanding contemporary violence too, whether we're talking about revolutionary insurgents, soldiers in conventional armies, or indeed suicide bombers. For example, building on these findings, I teamed up with Julia Ebner, who's an expert on extreme groups and who'd been studying them undercover. Together, we came up with a plan to try to identify would-be terrorists before it's too late. One of the biggest problems facing the intelligence community is how to spot terrorists among a vastly larger population of ideological extremists who espouse unpleasant views, but who are unlikely ever to carry out acts of violence themselves. So Julia set out to develop a set of methods for analyzing statistically the writings of political activists to spot the telltale psychological traits that we predicted would lead to acts of violent extremism. The deadly cocktail we were looking for consisted of essentially 4 features. One was fusion with the in-group. Another was a strong belief that the in-group is facing an existential threat. Thirdly, demonization or dehumanization of the out-group. And finally, willingness to use violence if necessary to defend the group. The aim of our analysis was to pick out language used by political activists as telltale indicators of this deadly cocktail of ingredients. What we found was that the killers in our sample were far more likely to exhibit all 4 features of the deadly cocktail compared with those who were non-violent, even if they may have subscribed to quite extreme ideologies. This supports the view that ideological extremism alone is not the real driver of violence. The roots lie in a combination of factors, what we call this deadly cocktail. This award-winning research is now helping the intelligence community and also internet platforms to spot would-be terrorists through their online communications. And now Julia and I are applying the same approach to the speeches of authoritarian leaders around the world in order to predict better which of these leaders may be the next to unleash mass violence against their perceived enemies. But even if we can use our growing understanding of group psychology to anticipate intergroup violence, can we also use that knowledge actually to prevent or resolve conflicts? I believe we can. Let's just consider the following bits of evidence. Shortly after the Hamas attacks in October 2023, John Alderdice, whom I know many of you recently met here, actually in this very room, I think, gave an impassioned speech in the House of Lords in London, arguing that yet more violence in Gaza was not the solution. After reading the speech, it struck me really that it might be even more effective still if it emphasized shared sufferings on both sides of the conflict, and to see if we could use that to create a feeling of fusion across the lines of division. So I rewrote the speech a bit and asked Lord Alderdice to let me film him presenting this new version. When we showed the speech to a large sample of Americans, half of whom were Jewish and supported Israel's side in the conflict, and half of whom were Muslim and supported the people of Gaza, we found that listening to the speech increased fusion with the out-group and made people more trusting of those on the other side of the conflict and more open to friendship with them. Even more remarkably, when we repeated these measures with the same participants several days after listening to what was actually just a very short speech, much of the positive attitude change was still present. In other words, the speech continued to impact people for some time afterwards, making the prospect of openness to peace seemingly more achievable. Social cohesion can also be used very effectively as a crime prevention strategy. This idea also occurred to David Dean, the former vice president of Arsenal Football Club and one of the founders, actually, of the Premier League. David Dean is the creator of what he calls the Twinning Project. It's an initiative aimed at twinning professional football clubs across England and Wales to their local prisons, providing inmates with a chance to bond through a shared love of football. Shortly after announcing the start of the project at Wembley Stadium in London, he came to visit me and my colleague Martha Newson in Oxford, and together we hammered out a plan to carry out research into the effectiveness of the project in reducing reoffending. Martha and I have been studying the effects of the Twinning Project for several years, and our results are finally starting to come out. What we found so far is that the more bonded participants become with the Twinning Project, the less trouble they get into in prison, and the healthier and more resilient they become psychologically. We're currently conducting longitudinal studies to see how these positive effects impact their prospects in life after they're released from prison. Understanding the roots of identity fusion is the key not only to preventing intergroup conflict and crime, but also, I think, to working together more effectively on a global level. I first realized this many years ago when I went to live here in the rainforest of Papua New Guinea for 2 years as part of my doctoral research at the University of Cambridge. The group I lived with took me in as a member of their community. They helped me to learn their unwritten language and the intricacies of their ancient rituals and beliefs. They had no running water, they had no electricity, and they had very little money because they mostly lived off the food that they grew in the forest and in their gardens and the animals that they hunted. Now, one day when I was living there was a terrible storm, and as we sort of huddled together in the meeting house, I was told the story of a time when a cyclone struck Queensland in Australia across the sea. My friends in the village had been saving up the money that they could raise from cash crops with the idea of supporting some kind of community project, perhaps a school or an aid post. But when they heard of the sufferings of rich Australians just across the water, they decided to give away a huge portion of their savings to provide those people with assistance. When I tried to dig into why, the best answer I could get was that we're all basically descended from the same ancestors, which makes us all family. And helping out is basically what you do when your family needs you. So if people living in a remote part of the rainforest can view humanity as one giant family, maybe that's possible for the rest of us as well. To investigate that idea empirically, Lucas Reinhardt and I set up an experiment in which participants were shown a video in which the journalist, A.J. Jacobs, explained that all of us are descended from common ancestors, and therefore all human beings constitute a single family. By making our shared biology so salient, this video significantly increased levels of fusion with humanity at large among those who watched it, compared with a control condition in which fusion was measured before rather than after seeing the video. We've also shown that shared experiences of motherhood can increase feelings of fusion towards women in faraway countries. In all these studies, whether the key factor was shared ancestry or shared life-changing experiences, feelings of shared essence and fusion with other human beings around the world were also shown to motivate action in the form of donations to global charities. Our moral intuitions and our capacity to fuse are often manipulated together by the media and by divisive leaders in ways that create polarization. A good example of this is the way that people in Poland became polarized over the issue of abortion. In 2020, the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland ruled that abortions in cases of fetal abnormalities should be made illegal. In response to this ruling, protests were staged on a scale that hadn't been seen actually since the Berlin Wall came down. However, pro-life activists felt just as strongly about the issue and were willing to fight in defense of the court ruling. To dig deeper into these issues, I teamed up with a group of psychologists in Poland to run a survey to investigate the moral concerns of people on both sides of this issue. What we found was that the pro-life and pro-choice camps were emphasizing different parts of the universal moral repertoire. Remember that there are these 7 cooperative rules that everyone agrees are morally good. But if you supported the pro-life side of the argument, it turned out that you were much more likely to focus on just 3 of those 7 universal rules, namely respect for authority, particularly Catholic religious authorities, caring for kin, for family, and in particular the rights of the unborn in this case, and courage in the form of willingness to face up to the responsibilities of raising a child with congenital abnormalities. But if you were on the pro-choice side of the argument, you were much more likely to emphasize one of the 7 moral rules above all the others, namely loyalty to group, and particularly to a kind of imagined sisterhood, sharing your experiences. Preferences like these influence the kinds of information we're exposed to when we're surfing the internet and using social media. If you're interested in viewing content emphasizing the shared sufferings of women with unwanted pregnancies, it naturally increases fusion with a particular in-group. The same thing happens when we're exposed to content that emphasizes the shared suffering caused by abortions, or that strengthens fusion with a community of believers who regard things like abortion and contraception as sinful. Now, one way in which these kinds of problems can be overcome, I guess, is to create citizens' assemblies or similar forums for tackling potential wedge issues like abortion. This approach proved remarkably successful in Ireland, which is another region, of course, where the population was deeply divided over the abortion question. There, an assembly was created by sampling a cross-section of the population and providing guidance on technical and scientific aspects from respected experts. A major advantage of this form of decision-making is that it allows everyone to be heard, but also to take seriously the viewpoints of people on the other side of the debate, something that often fails to happen in online echo chambers. As a result of this process, a referendum on abortion was held in Ireland, and a very strong consensus emerged. Now, citizens' assemblies are just one of many ways in which the destructive effects of populism and polarization can be averted. Now that we're beginning, I think, to understand better the psychology needed to solve collective action problems more effectively, I'd argue that we need to apply that knowledge to the way we do business, to the way we run our countries, and to the way we manage our natural resources. I believe we can actually pull together to achieve a more peaceful and sustainable future if we make the effort to understand ourselves better and apply that understanding in wise and consensual ways. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here with Harvey. Harvey, the professor, like to be known as Harvey. And he's been a very deep and profound exposition, a summary of your book, all in 30 minutes. That's an amazing feat, don't you think so? Amazing. Now, I thought I heard you spoke about a couple of things. One is loyalty to groups. The other is trust, that somehow loyalty and trust, they all go together. I read somewhere about this evolved psychology. I'm just going to make a comment and ask a question, and I'll leave the rest of you to ask the rest of the questions. There is one thing here about evolved psychology. Someone said that it's the Stone Age minds, understanding the Stone Age minds in a space age world. Did you come across that?
Yeah.
Did you like that? Did you invent that yourself? Was it from you?
It wasn't from me. I have a bit of a disagreement with the idea of it. I mean, but we can come to that.
It's a nice little
it's a nice, concise idea. Yeah, it is.
Yeah. But you see, evolved psychology, what you're trying to say is that we go back and back and back to the time when we began. All the memories and all the way we survive and all that actually inform where we are today. And many of the things they are saying about the 7 values and all that, they were all there for us to survive and to grow and to multiply so that we don't become extinct. Isn't that part of it? Now, my question to you is, if you have all those 7 commonalities in the world, 60 societies, and you found that they are all together on this, then why aren't we more united than we are today as a world? That's my question.
It's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that our evolved psychology is very rich and diverse. It is not reducible just to these 7 principles of cooperation that we judge morally good everywhere. There's a huge plethora of features of our psychology that have a deep evolutionary history. But there are 2 kinds of evolutionary history that we need to worry about here. One is the biological evolution over really long time periods of our, through natural selection of the kinds of features of our psychology that I think are pretty much inescapable. And as I was saying, we can't eliminate those things because they do just naturally resurface with each new generation. But there's another kind of evolutionary history, which is a cultural evolutionary history, in which our moral ideas have been extended and developed and cultivated and built upon in a variety of ways. And a good example of that is in the domain of religion. For most of human prehistory, our ideas, our religious ideas, our ideas about the supernatural, or about the magical efficacy of rituals, or about life after death, or about many of these other things that we think of as part of religion, did not tap into all 7 moral domains in any kind of systematic way. Sure, we felt a need to be obedient in various specific ways towards ancestors, for example. But by and large, the gods, the spirits, and the ancestors didn't really care very much about the morality of human behavior. The moralizing religions that take an extensive interest in all aspects of our comings and goings and what we do in terms of our interactions with other humans, that's a newish idea that became, it took off in the first millennium BCE, but it actually has earlier roots in some regions of the world like Egypt. But it's a relatively new thing, right? Most of human prehistory, that idea isn't around. And so the world religions that we're familiar with today have put together a set of moral ideas and a set of ideas about the supernatural in a way that is a product of cultural evolution, not our sort of deep biological evolution. And I think it's crucially important to see both of those things together. We need to see those things together if we are to achieve any kind of unity or consensus. I'd rather say consensus on moral issues. We have all the intuitions in common, but if we're going to pull together, we have to apply them to things in a way that makes sense to all of us. And that might mean, collective action problems that we all have to deal with on a global level if we think about it seriously. I mean, the climate crisis is a classic example of that. But it's not the only one. I mean, intergroup conflict is destructive to all of us. So if we can find ways of achieving consensus on how we tap into our evolved psychology and how we build on the cultural evolutionary history as well and learn from our ancestors, I think that's really the key, is to put all of those things together. And that's more than just a Stone Age mind in a space age world.
Prof, maybe just one other comment before I open up, because I just heard you say something that's interesting. Biological and cultural. You made it so neat, like you can actually divide that so neatly. But I imagine that it's not so easy and not so neat and not so tidy. Because I assume that biologically, we evolve in order to survive. I think survivalism results in our cultural norms. In order to survive, we stop killing each other. That's a norm. That's a cultural thing. So one feeds the other, and the other feeds back. So why are you making it so easy to divide the two? I don't see it.
Well, I think you're right. It's not easy, but there are different units of selection involved in the evolution of our psychology. The units of selection are different than in the evolution of our cultural systems. I mean, the history of our cultural systems and is a process of winnowing out systems that are just less effective than others. And the reason why I got involved in building this global history data bank was so that we could choose a huge sample of the polities that have existed over the course of the last 10,000 years, essentially since farming was invented and spread, and we started to see much larger and more complex societies form. And the question for me and for my colleagues who work with me on this is really, what are the drivers of that process by which social complexity evolved? The drivers do not lie in our biological evolution. They lie in a winnowing process that occurs at the level of cultural groups. And this process of cultural group selection is what we want to understand using this huge database by analyzing statistically, based on the logic that causes precede effects, what are the things that come before the sharpest rises in social complexity over the millennia globally? And that means, and actually we now have answers to some of these big questions. We know that agricultural intensity is one of the big drivers. That's not a huge surprise to anyone, but it's nice to have it actually demonstrated in a more systematic way. The other, tragically, is warfare. That actually this dark and horrible facet of human nature and in particular the development of new military technologies or killing machines is really one of the big drivers of the rise of social complexity. Trouble is, we now live in a world where our weapons are so deadly that they could spell, they present an existential threat to all of us. So I don't think we can expect that process just to continue in that way. And that's why we need to be cleverer now. That's why we need to try and achieve consensus on issues of intergroup conflict globally. And that's why I think we need to draw on our evolved psychology in that context as well.
Harvey, I'm tempted to engage you further on warfare and all that, but ladies and gentlemen, the floor is yours. Ask him all the questions you want. Who's going to be first? Over there, you identify yourself and make your question to the point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Paul Hedges. I'm from RSIS itself. I'm not sure if it's quite a question or a comment, but maybe something to reflect. You mentioned these sort of 7 pillars of morality. And one thing that sort of strikes me is there's all sorts of ways in which we tell our stories, we have cultural systems which allow us to override these, like people's property. We have, if you like, sort of looking through, perhaps sort of talk about religion a bit, through religious texts, where they tell us we can go and take those people's land. And this, like, it becomes justified, it becomes moral to disobey these. So I'm just wondering, like, how we perhaps sort of deal with the problem of, like, yes, we have this common morality with the fact that we also completely disagree on this. And if I can just throw perhaps a second point to that, it reminds me perhaps what you mentioned of Hans Kuhn, who you're probably familiar with, the Swiss theologian, who came up a few years back with the Global Ethic Project. And he identified sort of 4 sort of core things he said, like, all religions have in common. He later expanded it to a 5th one as well around ecology. But again, this was seen as like just such a thin kind of sort of set of ideas. Like, if we break it down to these basics, it's so meaningless that nobody actually believes in any of this. They believe in something much more complicated. They believe in, like, the stories, the narratives of their tribe, more than, if you like, these common ethics. So I'm just sort of wondering, in terms of sort of the practice, well, what do we actually learn from sort of having these 7 things if nobody really believes in them, and they also have stories which tell them, well, we can override these in many different situations?
That's a really good question, thanks. And I mean, I think, first of all, it is crucially important that we try to think about the cooperative problems that we face, the collective action problems, and the moral solutions in ways that are precise and meaningful. I mean, it's no good if that's so general as to be vague and pointless. I mean, so I agree with you on that. But I think there are several respects in which the problem of us coming up with applying the same moral thinking in ways that lead to conflict over how to solve things can be addressed. I think perhaps one of the most salient of all is about the scale on which we apply our moral reasoning. And broadly speaking, this is a bit crude, but I think there's a distinction to be made between parochial moral reasoning, where it's just basically your in-group that you're applying the moral concerns to, versus universalizing moral concern. And we can be very, we can be very adamant that our territorial claims, for example, to property, to sort of fairness issues and so on, are all sort of driven by concerns about the advancement of your own group's interests. Or we could say, look, all of our in-groups will be better off if we can find solutions that work for everyone. And that's the sort of more universalizing approach to morality. And I'm obviously, unsurprisingly, in favor of the latter. I think there's a really important distinction, too, to make between the kinds of leaders that can get us there. Right now, the world is dominated by what I would call barrier-bound leaders who represent their in-groups largely to the exclusion of everyone else. And they see it all, they see moral competitions as zero-sum games. And they don't consider how actually their own in-groups could profit from taking into consideration more deeply the needs of other groups and to bring them into the domain of moral concern, which is really the starting point for a more universalizing application of our moral intuitions. And I think barrier-crossing leaders, the Nelson Mandelas of this world, we need more of those kinds of leaders They do exist actually in often at a grassroots level. They're much harder, they're much thinner on the ground as heads of state, although we have had quite a few who I think certainly, I mean, it's difficult to categorize a leader's career entirely in terms of barrier bound and barrier crossing, but there are a lot of leaders historically in the 20th century who I'd say, have a lot of barrier crossing attributes. But the world is becoming dominated increasingly by barrier-bound leaders, and I think this is a very frightening development and very harmful to humanity at large. So I think the big question for us should be, how can we meaningfully and specifically try to cultivate and foster more barrier crossers? How can we extend moral concern more universally? These are the challenges I think we need to face.
So on that, Harvey, there is a deep concern today that the way we are going, we're going to implode because we are going to self-destruct. Shouldn't that fear, that prospect, that horrible, terrible prospect, I mean, unite us even more to have a common in and out fusion of everything so that we can survive together. We're all in one little boat that will sink if we don't act together.
Yeah, it should. But it won't without real effort, because unfortunately we're not very future-minded naturally. We tend to think about the immediate problems that face us. We also tend to be quite parochial. This is I suppose if I were to say that there's an aspect of the Stone Age mind in a space age world that we need to deal with, this would be an example of it. But we know from history that we are capable of scaling up our cooperation, and we are capable of being cathedral thinkers, future-minded thinkers too, when under certain circumstances. But the crucial bit is under which circumstances, and how do we make those circumstances come about? And that's where I think we really need to look to the inventions and discoveries of our ancestors.
I wanted to say tongue-in-cheek, though, and then I will ask
the
others to ask the question. I wanted to say tongue-in-cheek in response to that. We keep on going back to the cave age mentality because that's where we evolved from, and that's how we are today. So, although we like to think that we are modern and we want to go forward, I think that is something about us that kept moving us backward into the cave age. I mean, just a comment.
Well, can I give just a very quick response to that, just an example, because there are many different ways in which I think one could illustrate a counter-argument on this. We are naturally ritualistic. That is something that we've shown. I've worked with a lot of developmental psychologists, and from a very early age, we copy what we call causally opaque behaviors that have absolutely no instrumental value whatsoever. Children love to copy stuff, and if we didn't naturally want to copy stuff, we wouldn't have the conventions and norms or language or any other of these features of culture that we have. It's a really fundamental aspect of human psychology, but it doesn't do very much in itself for building large groups. Why? Because we copy things in a way that is very heavily influenced by what's in our immediate environments. If you want to get a really big population all observing the same customs and rituals and conventions, etc., norms, then how do you scale it up? How do you get thousands and then millions, perhaps even billions of people identifying with the same symbols and identity markers? And the answer to that problem was discovered around about 10,000 years ago when some of the earliest farmers realized that increasing, very, very simple thing, increasing the frequency of rituals allows you to stabilize a set of beliefs and practices across a larger population. It makes it easier to spot when people step out of line, and it makes it easier to get people sort of more accepting of authorities within that social system and not coming up with their own innovations all the time and deviating from the norms. So routinization and repetition was a major discovery. It's not written into our genes. It's not part of our evolved psychology. It's something that had to be discovered as a sort of cultural gadget that allowed us. Now, we've got lots of other gadgets now, from writing systems to all kinds of external systems of storage of information. And we've got the internet now, which allows very high fidelity copying of things and transmission of norms and values and beliefs and things like across huge populations. The question is, how do we manage? There's a cascade of psychological consequences of these cultural innovations, and we need to think wisely about how we manage those things, because they can make us more cooperative on larger scales, and they can make us more future-minded, but they'll only do so if we manage them intelligently.
Surely. Question? Yes.
Good afternoon, Prof. My name is Cheryl, and I run an NGO here in Singapore. So my question to you is about whether you had an opportunity to kind of use this particular lens that you have presented in phenomena such as like self-radicalization. And I mean, what I appreciate is the work that you've done to excavate this whole notion of the fusion identity. And my question here is with regard to the production of fusion identity formation. And how is it that, you did mention because of certain personalities that are geography bound and all that, or boundless, so to speak, yet there are individuals who have managed, despite the fact that they have no physical socialization, and pretty much you have to dig into the internet to find material for you to be self-radicalized. And yet, the convictions that some of these individuals have are closer to what you've presented with the Libyan fighters, that they are willing to, take up arms, to enact violence, and so forth, for people that they have no tangible emotional, cultural connections. So have you had an opportunity to, to make a comment or do analysis based on this particular phenomenon?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. I mean, you get this weird phenomenon of fixation where people become obsessed, preoccupied with a particular idea. And that process of fixation can create a sort of set of commitments that feel to the person experiencing them like they're really fundamental to your personal self. I mean, a kind of acid test of that is you say to the person, would you be the person you are today without those beliefs? Would you be you? And if the answer is no, I can't imagine me being me without those features, then we know that's fundamental to the personal autobiographical self, the essential personal self. If that is felt to be shared with other people, you've got a foundation for fusion. But I guess your question is, how on earth could a self-radicalizer become fused based on the conviction of sharedness when they're not actually interacting with many other people? And there are ways in which this happens. I mean, I was alluding in a very kind of perhaps indirect way in that talk a bit earlier to the fact that news feeds tell us that people are suffering in the world with whom we identify, and we can feel that as our own personal shared suffering. I remember talking to Nasir Abbas, who was part of essentially a terrorist organization, and his early experiences of radicalization were through newspapers. In subsequent decades, it's become the internet and it's become other sources. But these are indirect sources of information that tell you that the things that you feel are personally self-defining are shared by others. And I've seen this cross the species barrier. I remember, I don't know if many of you in this room remember Cecil the Lion, who was shot. Does that ring any? But I don't know if this was covered widely in Singapore. But it was a story that went viral when a lion was shot by an American dentist using a longbow. I don't know if this is ringing any bells. It generated, I mean, it's kind of, in some ways it might seem like a trivial story, but lions are always being shot in that way. This is nothing exceptional. But this got picked up by certain celebrities, and the story went viral. And the lion was actually part of a conservation project that some of my colleagues in Oxford were running. And so the phone lines in Oxford jammed with people saying, I want to do something about lion conservation. And I said to the guy who was a friend of mine running this conservation program, I said, can I run a survey with the people who are trying to do something active to help with lion conservation. And he gave me thousands of email addresses. So I was able to get this survey going and study the fusion process over time. And it has a lot of the hallmark features of what you might call self-radicalization. I mean, these are people who actually cared about something that I think we'd probably all feel pretty comfortable with, which is lion conservation, right? What's wrong with that? But psychologically, the processes are not that dissimilar. And I think what was going on, and this was revealed through the survey data, was that over time, people were feeling more and more convinced that the sufferings of this lion were also their own sufferings. No, they'd never, been to Africa. They'd never encountered a lion. They didn't have, but they felt convinced that the sufferings of the lion were their sufferings. And so I do think you can have this vicarious, indirect experience of shared suffering. And I think this is what goes on in the self-radicalization process.
Yes, Prof.
Thanks, Prof. Whitehouse. Excellent presentation, as usual. When you mentioned just now, earlier in your presentation, that looking at cases of some of those fighters you encountered, Libya, you mentioned shared suffering was a good indicator, predictor of the highest level of identity fusion between the fighters and the groups. Because when you said that, it got me thinking about, how perhaps, when we look at the history of perhaps in Southeast Asia, not entirely the same, not identical, but there used to be, I remember a time when, an earlier period when, for example, in 1970s, 80s, there were many people here were talking about the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia and how that unified ASEAN as an organization, because there's a sense of a shared threat coming from a particular country, but of course that was in the past. And if you look at today's headlines, right, the situation in Europe, there's a lot of people talking about how the Russian invasion of Ukraine has increased the solidified Western Europe, NATO, in ways which were not imaginable even just a few years ago. So what I'm trying to ask is there do you need a sense of shared threat, a common sense of shared threat to create this kind of identity fusion, or this kind of greater identity fusion can arise through other ways?
Yes, I mean, it's a great question. I think most people are much more familiar with the process of identification than they are with the process of fusion, unless there's a proviso to that. I'll come to that in a minute. But when we think about big groups going to war, nations or states going to war, I think we are mainly thinking about identification in many cases. And remember when I was talking about that in the talk, I was saying this is a process in which your personal self and your group self have a kind of hydraulic relationship. You make one salient, and the other becomes less accessible. So it's depersonalizing. So when you think about your membership of the group, you don't really feel any kind of very close connection to your own personal identity. That's how most people think of their country, how most people, I think one of the things that comes with that automatically is a sense of competitive or rivalrous attitudes towards the outgroup. Psychologists call it outgroup derogation. You can't, if you identify with the group, you naturally derogate outgroups. But that isn't the case with fusion. Fusion is different because if you think of fusion, the primary target that most people will understand immediately and quite intuitively, most people, is family. Right? If you think about your family, most of us are fused with our families, even if we're not fused with any other group. Some of us might be fused also with a football club or with a religion or with something like that. But most people, at least, if they're not fused with any other group, they'll get what it is to be fused with your family. And loving your family does not mean hating other families. It doesn't automatically tap into some kind of outgroup rivalry. Except, and this is the big exception, when your group comes under attack. If your family, is attacked, then you unleash a huge amount of energy. Who wouldn't do everything imaginable to save a family member? It's so intuitive. But it doesn't get triggered without the outgroup threat being present. And as I said earlier when I was talking about the deadly cocktail, if you also don't think violence is the way to deal with stuff, it doesn't make you dangerous, even if your family is threatened. And if you don't dehumanize the outgroup, likewise, you're not presenting a danger. So I think fusion only turns into violence when you have these other characteristics that come together. So I know that this is a slightly complicated answer to what looks on the face of it like a simple question, but I think it has to be that complicated and no more to answer it.
I was just thinking that when you're talking about fusion in terms of family, there are many groups in our society where we use the idea of family to fuse people together. Union, for example. Union members consider each other brothers and sisters. Church, family. So that's part of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about shared, Kumar, you talk about shared threat. I think in nation building in Singapore, I've always felt that one of the things that our government has been telling us is shared vulnerability. That we are vulnerable, we are a small little red dot. If we don't survive and help each other and be number one, we are not going anywhere. So the threat of vulnerability, I think, is very real. Question? Yes.
I used to work
Yeah, your name?
program here.
Thanks.
Program in national education in NTU. So basically, when I look at your model of 7 moral values, and I try to relate that to what I do in human factors and in terms of organizational psychology, groupthink, crew resource management, and so forth. The simplest reduction into moral-driven behavior doesn't quite apply in the real world because of several things. So it's social economic factors, social cultural factors, imperfection in knowledge, information, biases. All these come to shape human behavior. So and that would explain why we can't come together. So the question here is, when you say evolved psychology, basically you're implying dynamic changes. It is not static. So when I look at your example of fusion in the fighters, I tried in my head to see why they would think that way, okay, that they would put the group above family. And that could also be a factor shaped by immediacy, survival. And many of these fighters are fighting because they lost their family. So which comes first? The primary objective versus the secondary objective. So, and then of course you compare with the other one, the logistical support personnel, then you would say maybe there's also a selection at play. Those people who are not so fused died fighting. So I would like your comment on this because I'm trying to figure out why there should be a difference. So for example, when we do human factors research, we ask people in the subject pool, how long have you been in here? So for example, you work in a company for 10 years versus 2 years, there's some selection at play, self-selection. So how many of your fighters have been fighting for, say, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years? And how many of those in the other group? And that would give you the confounding factors. I think that might help to explain the differences.
Yeah, these are very interesting questions. I mean, one of the things to say about this shared experiences pathway to fusion is that it doesn't happen overnight. It's not, just to take as an example, since I mentioned it, the Cecil the Lion study. One of the nice things about that, it's not the only example, but it's a nice example of how we're able to track the fusion process over months so that, people didn't fuse with Cecil or with the Lion Conservation Unit or with any of the targets for fusion that we were measuring overnight. This was a process that took time. And the reason it takes time, as with the Libyan fighters, the revolutionaries, is because what we're doing when we fuse is we're first building a personal identity out of not just memories for specific episodes, but reflections on those memories that become part of your personal autobiographical self. That doesn't happen overnight. I mean, if you've been through something big, like a transformative life experience, it takes time where you think back over it and you mull over it. You may even savor the memory in some kind of way, but you may be troubled by PTSD. There may be many reasons why you come back to this and go over it and run over it. And to some extent, it can be a sort of unproductive process to some extent, a ruminative process. In others, it can be a process of reflection that leads to new insights and the expanded sort of semantic network of things around that experience. And in others, we talked about fixation earlier, where people become obsessed with certain elements of it. But all of these processes feed into the production of a unique personal history, autobiography, self. It's when you share that with other group members that you become fused. And that is a process. It's not an instant, we've got an enemy here and I'm going to experience fusion as a knee-jerk reaction to that. It's a process that comes out of the experiences that you have had in your past, which then become shared with the other group members.
Yeah, I'm fully convinced by that.
Okay.
What I'm saying is, after that,
Afterwards.
this process doesn't end.
No.
It's not the end point.
No.
The fusion can also, I think, in some cases, lead to be, diffused.
Yeah.
Diffused.
Yeah. And actually in Libya, we've did several subsequent surveys to look at how fusion changed over the decade that followed the 2011 uprising. And yes, it did change, and there's some really interesting features to that process that we need to understand. Yeah, completely agree.
Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we've got about 10 minutes left. You asked question here and here. What about people here? Yes. One of you?
Hi,
Thank you.
Professor. I'm Dylan, a student. And I was wanting to ask, in terms of about this fusion, what is it about the human that sort of predisposes us to draw towards this identity? So the question I have is essentially, I was asking whether humans are they fundamentally selfish, and do you think our ability to associate to larger groups and make sacrifices as part of this fused collective identity is just a different manner of acting in our self-interest? Or do you think there's something else, perhaps like a tendency to altruism as well? I was just wondering in terms of what is the quality of humans that allows us or that pulls us to both act in self-interest in terms of what you mentioned about the in-group, but also be able to make these sacrifices as a collective? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, fusion and the forms of behavior that follow from it, such as the willingness to fight and die to protect a group, implies acts of altruism rather than of selfishness, because we're talking about taking yourself out of the gene pool by, or are you? So I talked about two pathways to fusion. One is about shared biology, and one is about shared experience. The shared biology pathway might be explained by kin selection. So yes, altruism, but from the gene's eye point of view, not from the point of view of the actor who may die as a consequence of their heroism. So maybe in groups which are sufficiently closely related genetically, self-sacrificial behaviors could evolve based on kin selection, because your genes stand a better chance of surviving if you lay your life on the line for closely related individuals. However, so many of the groups in our deeper sort of prehistory were not so closely related genetically that one could explain the emergence of fusion exclusively in those terms. And the evolution of something like fusion does not have to rely on one mechanism. It could have multiple ones. And I teamed up with an evolutionary biologist who developed some very sophisticated mathematical models to show that actually the fusion mechanism could evolve by conditioning cooperation on past experience rather than requiring kin selection. That gets us into rather technical areas, but basically what it means is that you can get altruistic behavior evolving in a way that does not require kin selection. I think that's the simplest answer, but the reality is that obviously as you delve into this, it's a more complex technical problem to explain that in detail.
Right. Yeah, one more question?
Hi, Pepe from NTU Psychology. I was wondering, maybe this is a bit too soon, but is there anything that you wished you wrote differently in Inheritance? Or a different way to ask that question is there anything you rethought recently?
There were lots of passages in the book that never made it, and I regret that they didn't. So I had a very nice editor, but at times he seemed quite harsh to me because he said, Harvey, the book's way too long, and actually it was probably twice the length it is before he came at it with his knife and started hacking things out. So one regret is that it couldn't be longer, but there are commercial reasons for that. There's lots of reasons for it. And plus, I think in order to make a simple story with a strong narrative arc, I tended to simplify certain things. So it was a necessity. And as an academic, I don't really like doing that, but it was necessary to tell that story. So there were three features of our evolved psychology that I focused on in the book: conformism, religiosity, and tribalism. And I really only talked about tribalism today, but the other two were 2/3 of the book. And I had to tell a story with a narrative arc about how those things got managed over the course of the last 10,000 years of human history and prehistory. And in order to do that, I had to sort of organize them in a somewhat chronological way. So I talked about the conformism over the first few thousand years of that period, and then, I left tribalism to the sort of last few thousand, and so that you could have a sort of chronological sequence. So there were things like this. I guess there were narrative devices that meant I had to sort of cut out a lot of stuff that was really important, that I really wanted to talk about. So regrets, I have a few.
Well, just to remind everybody, the book is available outside, and I'm sure Harvey will be more than happy to autograph it for you.
Oh, more than happy, yeah. Of course.
So I see two hands up there. Yours first.
Thank you for a wonderful speech. And my name is Jay. I'm responsible for creating some museums in Haw Par Villa, historian by profession. And while in the process of creating Hell's Museum in Haw Par Villa by way of the 10 Courts of Hell, and creating a new museum on the rise of Asia, or the re-emergence of Asia, what stood out for us was the common cultural DNA that exists in the Indo-Pacific. When you look at Europe, it's very clear biologically and culturally there is a conformism that connects it. And so your point about the evolutionary history being broken into biological and cultural is something that I'm starting to see itself in the research that we do. Because as Hinduism and Buddhism spread to Southeast Asia and to East Asia, from the Punjab to Korea to Japan, you see a common cultural DNA that people are not aware is actually connected. The karmic philosophy, for example. While in West Asia to Europe, you have the Zoroastrian, Abrahamic cultural trend. In the karmic trend, or in the karmic cultural DNA background, there is a perspective that I think still dominates in Asia today. And that starts with the Sanskrit phrase, Mata, Pita, Guru, Devam. Your mother, your father, your teacher, before God. God is only number 4, all right? And God doesn't play such a central role that he's not the only pathway to salvation. So God is de-emphasized in that sense. While in the Zoro-Abrahamic faiths, God is above everything. And if you look at it, the 10 Commandments, or in Islam, God is it. And you would always choose God over potentially your parents. When I met up with the Dalai Lama some years ago, and the question was asked, what would it be his living legacy? He suggested secular ethics, that there's a need to create common ground. And so I've got a controversial question for you. should we de-emphasize God?
Well, you caught me by surprise with that last sentence, but I agreed with what the Dalai Lama said to you. In maybe a simple way to express this is to think of the Abrahamic traditions and the karmic traditions as companies that I think need to merge. There needs to be a merger. And actually, I was asked recently to meet with the sort of top brass of two companies that are merging right now. International Paper, that produces a lot of the paper in paper products in America, and DS Smith, that produces a lot of the paper products in Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. And these two companies are merging, and they are kind of like the karmic and Abrahamic traditions having to come together. They are very different in some fundamental ways, but they also have commonalities. And one way you can see this, it's not the only way, and maybe it's a rather superficial way, but it was an easy way to build a narrative, at least from my perspective, was to look at their mission statements, and what values do they emphasize. And it's very interesting because if you take the 7 cooperative principles, each of those companies emphasize just a few of them. I mean, I don't want to overdo this analogy because actually I think the karmic traditions and the Abrahamic traditions emphasize all 7 in both cases. So this is a slight simplification, but I'll justify that in a minute. But the companies didn't. They covered 3 or 4 at most on each side. But they also had gaps that neither of them had exploited or tapped into. And my view is that if they want to work together cooperatively as companies, they would be wise to choose those ones that are relative virgin territory and find common ground in them. Not to discard the valuable stuff they've already got, but to add more that they can both sign up to and create in an innovative way, something that they're both into and feel strongly and positively about. And that is where I think East and West and other, actually it's not just, that doesn't exhaust the potential sort of cultural DNA type of things, if you want to use that metaphor. I mean, I think all of the traditions, whether it's Pacific Island nations that have another kind of cultural DNA, you could say, or regions of South America or Sub-Saharan Africa, etc., I think all of us need to find something what we can all sign up to. Not just not a declaration of human rights, we've done that, but maybe something more like a declaration of human obligations. Maybe something that taps even more deeply into our shared moral systems. That, I think, is a sort of global DNA. That's what I think we need, above all.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that our time is up, just up. And, Dalai Lama said that his religion is kindness. And to your point, I think that kindness needs a kind God. So let them come together. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, please give our honored guests a round of applause. Thank you so much.